Okay, so I have my handy dandy board here too. As you guys know, I like to draw, even though it sucks. All right, the other question the other group had was learning objectives. These are what were originally in there. How they relate to the learning objectives from the email that LaBarbara sent you and the syllabus thing that you guys got, I don't know. I didn't look at that. Okay. All right. So what we're going to so this is all about hormones and how you treat hormone disorders. Now, hormone disorders are, depending on what you're talking about, are not incredibly common unless you're talking about like diabetes mellitus. Okay. But most of your hormones are not going to be that common. So a lot of these drugs you may not see a lot. And we're not covering every hormone. So I only cherry picked. I went through this and only put in the hormones that are related to what was already in the PowerPoint. Okay? Unless I thought it added something. So overview, talking about hormones. Hormones are secreted by endocrine glands. Where do hormones go once they're secreted? Blood. Where do they go from there? Are you going somewhere?
Pardon?
You going somewhere?
No, I'm just keeping my balance with the book bag on. I'm
Okay.
in like meerkat mode.
Okay. Cody, you keep it entertaining. I love it. All right. So a hormone gets released into the blood. It can go anywhere. How do cells know how to respond to it?
They have receptors.
They have receptors for it. All right. So so that's the topic we're covering is hormones, receptors, and how do we go through that. This is just a good summary slide. This was given by your instructor, so I didn't put this in there. Just kind of like where your hormone secreting glands are and what they secrete, but she only is neck up. So we have our hypothalamus that secretes a lot of hormones that control what's released from the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland can then affect the thyroid. Where's our thyroid? Right here. Or the adrenal glands. Where are they? Right. And our gonads. Right? So, just a general summary slide to go back to. Here's how most hormones work. Like acute stress doesn't matter. You have the hypothalamus. Like we went over this in class, right? At one point, we had the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, thyroid axis, gonad axis. Okay, so hormone is released from the hypothalamus that tells the anterior pituitary to release a hormone that tells the adrenal gland to release a hormone. Okay. Now, when that hormone rises to high enough level, it can go back and shut off the hormone from the anterior pituitary and shut off the hormone from the hypothalamus. And what do we call that pathway, generally speaking? Negative feedback. Okay. So most of our hormones work by negative feedback. In this case, we're using the increase in hormone levels to negative feedback onto the hypothalamus and pituitary. But if you're a hormone that controls like calcium levels, for example, it's the level of calcium that will control the negative feedback. Okay? So again, the stress part's not important. It's the negative feedback concept. All right. Thyroid gland. We know where it's located. We talked about that. Right around the trachea, you can actually feel your thyroid gland. And in fact, next semester, LaBarbara will show you how to do like a really in-depth thyroid gland. Like I had no idea you went into that much detail to assess a thyroid. But on either side, the structure under the microscope is like this. So these things right here are called follicles. All right. Where else do we find follicles? I don't have any. Ovaries down there. What'd you say?
I was thinking something else.
Okay. So these have a similar structure, much different function. The cells surrounding the outside of the follicle, those are called follicular cells. And the center part is called colloid. All right? That whole follicle, it's geared towards secreting thyroid hormones T3 and T4. Okay? That's its purpose. These other cells that you see outside of the follicles, by location, they're called extrafollicular cells. By function, they're called C cells because they secrete calcitonin. I'm always paranoid that I'm not really recording. All right. We're not going to be concerned with calcitonin for this lecture. It's just going to be T3 and T4. Notice that the name of T3 is triiodothyronine. So what does that mean? 3 iodines, right? Whereas T4 would be 4 iodines. Notice that T4 is in much higher abundance, but T3 is our most metabolically active portion. So T4 eventually gets converted to T3. All right, what's its function? T3, T4, increase basal metabolic rate of your cells. So, what's the target for T3 and T4? What's the target cell? Any guesses? What cells have a metabolic rate? What cells metabolize? I'll give you a hint. It begins with A and rhymes with Paul. All cells, right? So targets are all cells. Paul, isn't Paul our skeleton?
He was Paul was the one who was over here.
Phil. It's Phil. Max, Sam, and Phil. Max, Sam, and Phil. Okay. Anyway, people are going to be listening to this lecture being going, what the fuck did they talk about? It's also essential for growth and development because once we have to keep our metabolic rate of our cells at a constant level so that we develop properly. In fact, if you don't have T3 and T4 when you're in utero, that can lead to some severe nervous system disorders before you're born. All right? We know iodine is an integral part of the molecule. Where does iodine come from? Iodized salt, our diet. Okay? Can we get iodine from other things in nature besides salt that the government added to it or mandated that got added to it?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Okay.
A lot of things.
So if you want to get iodine in your diet,
So people that are allergic to like iodine, like the yeah, is that yeah. Can I don't know what I'm trying to ask, but is it the same? Like, is it the same? Are they allergic to like? You know how some people are allergic to water because it like mixes with their skin and then they're like have an allergic reaction.
no.
You've never heard of that?
Yo, I did. I have. Yes.
Yeah,
But
that's crazy. You know how that's like an allergy, like the iodine allergy?
yes.
So
Could this
yeah.
be affected?
Yes.
The real answer is I don't know.
Okay.
But we all have. So let's say we have a person that does have an iodine allergy. Do they have a thyroid anymore? Right? So that would be a good thing to look up. Like, if they do have an allergy and iodine is important for your thyroid hormone function, do we get rid of that thyroid and prevent the allergy? I don't know the answer to that question. I doubt it. So I doubt that those two are related, but good question.
Can you get iodine if someone has hypothyroidism? Or no?
Yeah. I'm not giving you pharmacology, though. Okay. Speaking of, where should I post this?
Post what?
Maybe in
Somewhere
the
lecture?
Pharm?
Yes.
YouTube.
A new section.
In Pharm? In Pharm?
Where you put the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah, where you put the PowerPoint.
Okay. All right. This slide, the words came from your Pharm instructor. The picture came from me. And I'll put it to you. The only thing I did was I transposed the first and second bullets because you have to extract from the plasma before you transport, not the other way around. You don't transport then extract, right? So that's why. But everything, almost everything that's said here is in this picture. I love pictures, so I'm going to go off of the picture. All right. So you have iodine being transported in your blood. It gets to the thyroid gland, and iodine is symported into the cell with sodium by a pump. It's called the sodium iodine symporter, or NIS. That's what that means. All right. The iodine, notice that it has a charge. It goes through the cell, goes into the colloid, and the colloid has a bunch of proteins in it. Special proteins. These proteins are rich in the amino acid tyrosine. Okay, they have a lot of tyrosine. So when iodine goes in, it immediately gets oxidized. So it goes from the negative charge iodine to a molecular iodine, okay, I2. And once it's molecular iodine, then it gets coupled to tyrosine. Okay, so that's what's showing down here. This red represents the protein. These represent tyrosine residues. Notice the iodine gets attached. Then these tyrosine residues get linked to each other, and they're on the protein. So if this protein were to go make thyroid hormones, which hormone would be made, just based on that picture alone? T4, because we have 4 iodines. Okay, good. All right. Once you have the oxidized iodine and they're added to the tyrosine molecules, and the tyrosine molecules get linked to each other, we have a variety of molecules. MIT is mono iodine. DIT is diiodine. Then you have T3 and T4. All of those are attached to the proteins, and as a group, they get transported back into that follicular cell. T3, T4, MIT, DIT get cut off by proteases. MIT and DIT, worthless. They get recycled. But then the T3 and T4 get secreted. Okay? So they get lopped off that protein molecule, and they get secreted as T3, T4 in the blood, and then they go out to make other cells happy. All right? T3 and T4 have to be transported by a protein because T3 and T4 are fat soluble. That's important because when we talk about fat soluble or steroid hormones, because they're fat soluble, pretend that's a cell, where is their receptor located? Is it on the surface of the cell, or is there a receptor inside the cell? Inside the cell. If you are a fat soluble hormone, then you're going to go right through and you're going to bind to your receptor inside the cell. Now, it could be in the cytoplasm, could be in the nucleus. That's going to depend on the hormone. All right? Here, it's in the nucleus. All right? So what happens is T3, actually, T4 most abundant. Once it gets inside the cell, look what happens. It gets converted to T3. So T3 is our active form. T3 binds to its receptor, and any steroid hormone, any fat soluble hormone that's binding to an intracellular receptor is going to activate genes. Genes, not Jeans. All right? Activate genes. And what do genes do? They make, before that, mRNA, and then you make proteins. All right? So because you are making new proteins to elicit an effect, fat soluble, hormones take time to act, but their effects are long-lasting. All right? What if you're a water-soluble hormone? I'm doing a slight segue here. First of all, where's your receptor? Membrane. All right? Fat-soluble proteins. You have a second messenger, and you activate things that are already in the cell. That acts much quicker, so effects are immediate. And because they're immediate, their effects are also short-lived. Okay? What's cool is that because we're talking about all this in here, like I can skip past a lot of that once we get to endocrine. All right, here's how negative feedback works. All right, first of all, what does T3 and T4 do? What's its primary function? Increase metabolic rate. All right, so if we have a low metabolic rate or low T3, T4, that will trigger thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, to be released from the hypothalamus. TRH will tell the anterior pituitary to release TSH. TSH will tell the thyroid to release T3, T4. T3, T4 goes to all cells. All cells start ramping up their energy, including the cells in the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. And because of either increased metabolism or increased T3, T4 levels, you're going to feed back and shut off TSH and shut off TRH. All right? And that's the classic negative feedback pathway for T3 and T4. Make sense? Good? Okay. All right. So specifically what do they do? If you have low T3, this is low T3, T4, high T3, T4. Just thinking about it, low T3, T4, low metabolism. High T3, T4, high metabolism. All right? So the entire pathway here is you're not going to deplete your energy stores to give the cells because your cells aren't very active. Okay? So if you look at all of those, you're not releasing glucose, you're not breaking down glycogen, you're not making proteins because your cells are sluggish, low T3, T4. Opposite, high T3, T4, you're breaking down glycogen. You're turning amino acids and fats into glucose, gluconeogenesis. You're increasing protein breakdown and protein synthesis because all your cells are revved up. Okay? So opposite effects based on metabolic rate. All right? If all of your cells increase metabolic rate, then your cardiovascular system's not going to be any different. So what would happen to heart rate if all your cells become more metabolically active? Heart rate goes up. What happens to stroke volume? Goes up. What happens to cardiac output as a result? Goes up, right? What happens to blood pressure? Could go up. Typically, in the early parts of this, it won't go up. Notice mean pressure is unchanged, but over time, you can have an increase in blood pressure. Good. Oh, never mind. Other effects, everything's ramped up. Respiratory system, GI motility, so diarrhea could be a effect of high amounts of T3 and T4. Increased CNS activity. Okay, you're not a genius, but you're nervous. You're paranoid. All right, so that's what we mean by revved up activity. Not like, hey, I'm going to read War and Peace in 5 hours. You guys know about War and Peace, right? It's like that thick. It's on my list. I plan on reading it. If I'm going to listen to it. If I listen to it, it's, I think, 68 hours.
Oh my god.
My dad is 200 pages from finishing it. All right, increased muscle strength if you have moderate increases in T3, T4, okay, because it's going to activate your muscles. But if you have too much T3, T4, you have decreased muscle strength because you have tremors instead. All right, so that's going to decrease your muscle strength. Not that they're weaker, it's just that they are doing something else besides active muscle. You're tired because your cells are all ramped up, but because your mind's always racing, you can't sleep. So paradoxical. And as far as sexual function goes, if you have low T3, T4, it leads to impotence in men, in women, menstrual problems. All right. This I stole from nursing. You see these all in nursing curriculum, these kind of pictures, to give you a quick view of what hypo versus hyperthyroidism is, or other endocrine disorders. Hypothyroid, low metabolic rate. What's going to happen? You're going to be sluggish. You're going to be tired. You're going to be fatigued. You're going to have cold intolerance. Like you go out in a 75-degree day and you're going to be like, right? You can't handle the cold. You're going to gain weight. Heart rate's going to be slow. Okay? Because your body is not very active. Hyperthyroidism, on the other hand, you're like revved up, like you just had 20 Red Bulls and no sleep. Okay? So tremors, intolerance to heat. So, I mean, if your metabolic rate's already revved up, what's your basal temperature going to be too? It's going to be higher, so you're not going to be very tolerant in hot environments. So Florida would be not a good place to go. Do what?
It's not a good place in general.
I want to move to Florida. Like that's my life goals right now. For the winter, lake house in the summer. I can dream. In Florida?
Like Lake House in Florida?
No, lake house up here. Lake house in Florida, I need to put up a fence to keep out alligators. Actually, no, I'd want them to come up. Increased heart rate, tachycardia, weight loss. Okay, think about metabolic rate and how that would manifest itself in your body. This is not mine. I'm not covering it. So you know thyroid, you know T3, T4, you know what they do. Not mine, not mine, not mine, not mine. Oh. So I did plan on giving this whole lecture to you guys. I wouldn't have included all of this stuff in there. I would have just gone straight from the lecture and edited some things. One of the reasons why I put this picture up here is some of the drugs you're going to go over affect this part of the T3, T4 pathway. Okay, so the oxidation and the coupling. All right, parathyroids. Where are they located? Take your thyroid, look on the back of it, and you have 4 spots that are your parathyroid glands. Most of your parathyroid are these chief cells. Where else did we see chief cells? Stomach. And they secreted acid. Okay, so they secrete acid. Here, they're not secreting acid. And I'm not sure what the relationship between these chief cells and the stomach chief cells are. Maybe they have a similar morphology. I don't know. Not important, though. Chief cells are what make your parathyroid hormones. And parathyroid hormones are 34 amino acid fragments, which means they are peptide hormones. And because they're peptide hormones, they are generally water soluble. All right, so where's their receptor? Outside. You activate second messenger systems. All right, the actions, in a word, calcium goes up. They increase your blood calcium. So parathyroid increases blood calcium. All right. It also tells the kidneys to activate vitamin D. Right? Why is activating vitamin D important? Increases absorption of calcium. All right? So parathyroid hormone doesn't give a shit about what the other effects of vitamin D are. They want to make sure that your intestines are absorbing enough calcium. So I like the picture better. This picture, I will tell you, your Pharm instructor put that in here. I added a few things. So anytime you see vitamin D forms, I added those. Not because you need to know them, but because when I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, how did vitamin D change? What do you mean activated? So I put it there for that purpose if you're curious. All right, so here's what happens. Hypocalcemia, low calcium. Parathyroid glands sense that. They're going to secrete parathyroid hormone. Okay? Parathyroid hormone's going to have 3 target organs: kidneys, bone, and small intestine. Let's start with the bone. How is parathyroid hormone going to tell bone to increase calcium? What's it going to tell bone to do? Do what? It's going to activate osteoclasts. Osteoclasts break down bone. Okay, if you break down bone, you're putting calcium into the blood. It's going to tell osteoblasts to stop building bone. Okay, so that's how you're going to increase blood calcium. It's going to tell the kidneys to not get rid of calcium, so stop secreting it, and to make vitamin D. It's going to directly tell the small intestine, hey, you need to absorb calcium, but the vitamin D from the kidney is also going to help the intestines absorb vitamin D. Okay, so all that's going to increase blood calcium. All right, when blood calcium goes up, you feed back to the parathyroid glands and shut off PTH because you have enough. Okay, so if I take, let's say, Nick's blood and I measure parathyroid hormone, at one point in time, it's going to be a certain level. If I continuously take blood samples over, let's say, a couple hours in a day, what's our hormone concentration going to look like? Up and down, because of this negative feedback pathway. Okay? So, important thing to notice, if you are getting hormones on your patients, you need to get multiple spots of hormones in order to get an accurate representation of what their true levels are. All right. Not mine. I'm not going to cover this, but what would happen if you had hyperparathyroidism? What would be the result? Hyperparathyroidism. Okay, why? Right. We're taking that calcium from the bones, putting it into the blood. So what's your blood going to look like? High calcium, hypercalcemia. All right. Because I want to keep things consistent, hypercalcemia can be bad. Why? Think about this. What's that? It's my neuron. Okay. Normally we have a lot of positive ions on the outside, negatively charged on the inside, right? You all agree with that? And let's say it's minus 70, resting membrane potential. If I start adding, calcium is an extracellular cation. So if I start adding a bunch of extra calcium on the outside, what does that do to this number? I make it minus 80, minus 90. I create a bigger difference between the inside and the outside. What do we call that? It's like hyperpolarized. So nerves take a much bigger signal to activate. So nervous system effects of hyperparathyroidism and hypercalcemia would be sluggish nervous system action. So what if you had hypoparathyroidism and hypocalcemia? Less positive ions. Instead of minus 70, you're maybe minus 60. You're closer to threshold. Much easier to excite a neuron. Okay? So downstream effects of that are going to be what would happen if you overexcite muscle? What would happen if you overexcite the digestive system? What would happen if you overexcite things? Okay? Not covering any of this. Posterior pituitary. All right? Pituitary gland. Where's that located? Thank you. In your brain. All right. Or actually sitting just below your brain. Posterior to the end. Jesus. These are funny. and I like drawing. I like drawing, but if anytime I see the pituitary gland, it always reminds me of a pair of testicles. Right? You guys ever notice that with pituitary glands? All right. Here's our anterior. Here's our posterior. Okay. We're only going to be talking about one hormone from the posterior pituitary gland, and that's going to be ADH, which is what? Antidiuretic hormone, which is also known as vasopressin. Good. So, what are the two effects of this hormone? Water retention and vasoconstriction. Right. Okay. So, the other hormone from the posterior pituitary gland is oxytocin. All right, that's your snuggle hormone. And milk ejection. We're not going to cover that. Pharmacology only goes into ADH, so that's where we're going to keep it. Okay. Now, the thing about the posterior pituitary gland, I'm going to make this a little more realistic. Here's our hypothalamus. Here's our posterior pituitary. The neurons in the hypothalamus, the axons, actually extend down into the posterior pituitary. So ADH is made here, but then it's transported by anterograde axon transport down to the synaptic terminal, and it's stored here until it gets a signal to be released. Okay? So we call that a neurocrine hormone or neuroendocrine. Okay? So they're made in the hypothalamus, secreted by the posterior pituitary. All right. We already talked about the effects of antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. So how do we get it to be released? All right. If ADH tells us to hold on to water, what's the signal for ADH to be released? Dehydration. Okay. So let's do it this way. In our hypothalamus, we have, that is the weirdest looking cell I've ever drawn. All right. And then let's make this the second one. Okay, and this is our posterior pituitary. Okay? So, we're dehydrated. If we're dehydrated, water's leaving interstitial space, water is leaving cells in our body. We have specific cells in our hypothalamus called osmoreceptors. Osmoreceptors detect changes in osmolarity or solute concentration. So if we have water leaving the cell, what's going to happen to the cell? Two things. It's going to shrink, and solutes are going to become more concentrated. When that happens, the shrinking and the solute concentration, that will send a signal, that will send an action potential to activate the ADH neuron to release ADH. Right? ADH then goes where? Kidneys. And tells water to be retained. All right? If water is being retained, what's going to happen to the cell? It's going to swell back up, and then we're going to shut off ADH release. Okay? We're not going to be sending as many action potentials and shut off ADH release. So that's how that negative feedback pathway works. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Everything in this slide I covered here. And there's the picture. Here is a flow diagram. Do I need to go over it in any more detail? Or again? Okay. All right. Now, with ADH, you have two potential problems. Actually, three. First, we're going to do the second one first. If you have an increase in ADH, what's going to be your primary symptom? You're going to have edema. What about with urine? You're going to have very small urine output, and that urine's going to be
Concentrated.
yellow and stinky, right? Concentrated urine. All right? Too much ADH, syndrome of inappropriate ADH release, SIADH. That's what that means. Syndrome of inappropriate ADH release. All right? The opposite of that is diabetes insipidus. All right? Where else have you heard diabetes? Diabetes mellitus. Both of them have one characteristic in common. You pee a lot. In fact, that's what diabetes means, to pass through. So diabetes means you're peeing a lot. So what does insipid mean? Do what? No. Flavorless. So what does mellitus mean? Sweet. So guess how they used to diagnose diabetes?
They used to drink urine.
Legit. That's what they used to do. So that's why they call it tasteless versus sweet urine. That's where they got their names. So I put it to you guys this way. When you're talking about diabetes, distinguish. This is, you have DM. You have diabetes insipidus. Like, don't just say you have diabetes, because you don't, especially if they have this, you don't want to confuse your patient. Like, I have diabetes. Do I have to get insulin shots? No. Wrong diabetes. Then you'll have to explain that, right? So this isn't, I don't think this is that common. But with diabetes insipidus, you have decreased ADH effects. It could be two ways. You're either not secreting or making ADH from the posterior pituitary hypothalamus. Okay? That's called neurogenic diabetes insipidus. Or you don't have receptors on your kidneys for ADH. That's called nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. All right? If you have neurogenic, how do you fix it? If you're not making or producing ADH, how do you fix that? You give it exogenously. All right? If you don't have receptors, how do you fix that? It's not as straightforward. In fact, I don't know what the appropriate drug for that is. But your Pharm instructor will. SIADH and neurogenic, I don't think are as common. So mostly what they're going to talk about is neurogenic diabetes insipidus. Do you have a question?
No.
Okay. None of this is mine. Okay. Then we make way to our last one, adrenal glands. And where are our adrenal glands located? Kidneys. Good. And if they're on top of our kidneys, another name for them is the suprarenal. Sweet. All right. All right. Good. The adrenal glands, two parts to them. You have a cortex on the outside and a medulla in the middle. The cortex secretes strictly steroid hormones. The medulla secretes non-steroid hormones, more specifically amino acid-based hormones, or amines. They're catecholamines. They secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. And since your Pharm doesn't go into anything relating to norepinephrine or epinephrine, we're not going to cover it. So this is where it ends. Okay? They are synthesized by the amino acid tyrosine. What other hormone have we seen that uses tyrosine? T3 and T4. Good. These, though, are water soluble. T3, T4, lipid soluble. Good. All right, the adrenal cortex, if we break it down, has three zones to it, three layers. The outermost layer is called the zona glomerulosa. Where do you find glomeruli? Kidneys. So the hormone that's secreted from there goes to the kidneys. And that makes sense because it's aldosterone, and we've already talked about that in relation to the kidneys. Zona fasciculata, middle layer, glucocorticoids. That's your cortisol. Okay, gets secreted from there. And the last layer, right next to the medulla, is the zona reticularis, and that's going to secrete our androgens. All right. Since your Pharm lecture only goes into cortisol, that's all we're going to cover is cortisol. So why do I have aldosterone up here? Because Sometimes, if secreted in high enough levels, these steroid hormones can cross-react with each other. They can bind to the other's receptor. So we'll see that when we get to the end of the cortisol. All right. Cortisol is considered a stress hormone. It targets most of our body cells. And what it does is it increases glucose levels. Right? It's going to increase glucose levels. And why do we need to increase glucose levels during stress? For energy, to deal with that stress. Good. If levels get high enough, it will suppress the immune system. So we will talk about how that happens at the end. All right? Again, steroid hormone, receptors on the inside. Notice where it's located. Cytoplasm versus when we did T3, T4, that was directly in the nucleus. So this gets translocated to the nucleus, makes new proteins, have an effect. Okay? This is a summary of the effect as far as glucose goes. Okay, so what it does is it takes, breaks down proteins, increases amino acids to make glucose from non-glucose precursors. What do we call that? If we make glucose from fats and amino acids? No. Gluconeogenesis. Good. So gluconeogenesis. We're going to break down fat, shuttle that into gluconeogenesis. Okay? Make glucose, secrete it out into the periphery to give cells energy. But notice that glucose is inhibited in the muscles and it's inhibited in fat. So you're not going to use glucose to store anything. You're not going to increase glycogen storage in fat. You're not going to, muscle or fat storage in fat cells. Okay? Okay? Paradoxically, it also stimulates the formation of glucose into glycogen. So why would you stimulate amino acids and fats to make glucose, but you're telling yourself, the liver, to store glucose as glycogen? The answer is, I have two arrows there. Okay? Directly, cortisol makes glycogen. But is cortisol the only thing released during a stress response? No. Catecholamines are also. And they will cause the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. So I don't know the true answer because I didn't do the background research on it. But what I think is happening is cortisol is replenishing glycogen because it's constantly being broken down. So it's keeping the stores of glycogen up so it can be broken down into glucose. All right, as far as the immune system goes, I'm not going to go through the details of this. It's not important, but cortisol blocks everything associated with inflammation. If you don't form an inflammatory response, you don't fight off infection. All right, that's part of it. So it inhibits your innate immune system. But if you look here, well, it also inhibits your fever, which is part of the innate immune response. But it also suppresses T cells. And T cells are important for what? Our immune system. Active immunity. So, why is this important? Gets out a Pharm exam. Then you had an anatomy midterm. Then you have a clin diagnostics on Friday. The next Wednesday you have a physiology. And then you have another Pharm quiz the following Monday, I think. Right? All right. You're stressed. And that's why Maddie's like, oh my God, you just ruined my day. That's why students tend to get sick, especially around midterms and finals. All right? You guys, you're going to build up such an immunity to stress that you're like never going to get sick. You're going to be superhumans. Right? I don't know about super chill. Low level infected all the time. All right. So how does the negative feedback pathway work? Stress tells the hypothalamus to release corticotropin releasing hormone or the F stands for factor, hormone factor. They can be used interchangeably sometimes. That tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH tells the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Cortisol goes into our body, increases in concentration, feeds back to the anterior pituitary to shut off ACTH, feeds back to the hypothalamus to shut off CRH, and the process shuts down. Okay? This is just another picture showing the negative feedback pathway. If you like different colors. Okay? I put this here too. This is my slide. If you have too much cortisol, that can lead to something called Cushing syndrome. All right, and it could be either the overactivity of the anterior pituitary, too much ACTH stimulating the adrenal gland, or too much cortisol from the adrenal cortex directly. Okay, usually those are tumors or congenital conditions. All right, so too much glucose, hyperglycemia. You're going to have fat deposition. Specifically, it tends to accumulate in the face and on the back of the neck. So that's going to give you what they call a moon face.
The picture's blue, so she thinks it's like.
Oh, I hate that. No, so it doesn't create cyanosis. And back of the neck, that's typically called a buffalo hump. I hate that term. Weight gain, hair loss, and of course they're going to be immunocompromised, so they're going to be sick all the time. And another thing, what else do you notice about the Cushing syndrome patient? Striations in their skin. Okay. Now Addison's disease is just the opposite. You have too little cortisol. It's very rare. And again, it could be too little from the anterior pituitary or too little from the adrenal cortex. Just the opposite. Low blood sugar, hyponatremia, that's that cross-reactivity, okay, that we talked about. Weakness, hyperpigmentation.